Hello and welcome to this lecture. Today we are going to discuss what is thrombosis, and we start with the definition of thrombosis. It is a process of formation of solid mass in circulation from the constituents of flowing blood, and the mass is itself is called thrombus. So where the thrombus has been produced, they can be produced in the arteries or vein or in the heart chamber. But the main thing is that when we talk about the definition and we discuss the solid mass, so what we are talking about the solid mass, what is actually this is. So the solid mass could be high cholesterol or increase of the collagen. So it could be usually uh, the solid mass accumulate in the arteries in the form of cholesterol, and then atherosclerosis is the common example uh, that will be occur. So we will discuss them that with the thrombosis, what are the clinical uh, manifestations, and thrombosis it's itself is nothing unless it can go to your arteries and block them, or it go to your veins, or go to your heart chamber and can lead to ischemia, or the thrombus, the mass, it can go to your brain and can lead to the stroke. So you have to understand that itself thrombosis is nothing unless it travel to different body parts through arteries or vein or heart chamber. And what will be the solid mass? The solid mass usually could be high cholesterol level, or it mixed with cholesterol and collagen that mix together to make a hard mass, and then that mass may accumulate in arteries or vein or heart chamber. So we're discussing the same thing that I talk about. Normally, the blood is a fluid, and we know that it is the clot-free part. So usually the blood is always a flow. It is always flowing in a direction. But what happens when any injury occur in any site, and we know that any vascular injury they're talking about, so obviously the platelets will come into an act, and then uh, during vascular injury, the accumulation of platelets along with, if a person having high cholesterol level, can lead to the home localized plug. We mentioned here that only induced localized hemostatic plug mean blockage. And what happened that they mentioned that hemostasis and thrombosis are dependent on three vascular components, are depend on three journal components. One is vascular wall, number two is platelets, and number three is coagulation acid. So if we take a look of the journal components, so number one is vascular wall. So we must know that the thrombosis formation occur in either in arteries or in vein. So the vascular wall, when that get damaged, then we need to see that where this thrombosis occur. So it depend upon location of the vascular wall, either it is in arteries or in the vein. And then the second thing which is important is the formation of platelets. As we know that when the blood vessel will get damaged, then it leads to the formation of platelets, and with the platelets formation, it can lead to the development of thrombosis. Uh, then we have coagulation acid, and coagulation acid is the series of intrinsic factors or a series of chain of processes that is responsible for clotting, blood clotting. And we will discuss this thing in a separate video. But in general, you have to understand that coagulation acid is known as the process of formation of clotting factors.
At the site of vessel injury, the first platelets arrive to start sealing the wound. Simultaneously, the coagulation cascade with its various coagulation factors is activated. This involves two pathways, the extrinsic and the intrinsic pathway. Extrinsic activation begins with now exposed molecules of the vessel wall, such as tissue factor, which forms a complex with factor 7. Finally leading to the activation of factor 10. This factor 10A is the point at which the extrinsic and the intrinsic pathways of the coagulation cascade meet. The intrinsic pathway consists of various coagulation factors activating each other in a chain reaction. At its end, a complex with an additional cofactor is formed. This complex now activates factor 10. Since the two pathways merge at the level of factor 10A, this factor has a pivotal role in the coagulation cascade. Further down the cascade, factor 10A in combination with 5A activates thrombin and induces the so-called thrombin burst. One molecule of factor 10A can catalyze the formation of 1,000 molecules of thrombin. These large amounts of thrombin cause the further activation of platelets and the enhanced formation of fibrin. Fibrin then forms strands, making up the mesh that stabilizes the platelet plug in an arterial clot and holds together the red blood cells in a venous clot. It can be concluded that the central role of factor 10A in the coagulation cascade makes it a viable target for therapeutic intervention in pathologically altered blood coagulation.
What is the clinical significance of thrombosis? Obviously, wherever this thrombus will travel, it can lead to obstruction of that vessels. If it leads to your heart, especially in myocardial infarction, the arterial obstruction can lead to MI or ischemia, and patient can die from heart failure. Then if it can lead to your peripheral vascular, if it go to your vascular part, it can lead to peripheral vascular disease. Then we have peripheral vascular disease. Then it can cause deep vein thrombosis, or it can cause pulmonary embolism if it travel to your lungs. So there is a clinical significance of formation of thrombus, and it can lead to a number of pathological diseases. We will discuss detail in cardiovascular system. This is a picture that if this thrombus will block the arteries of the heart, it can damage the heart muscle, and it can give to ischemia. It can lead to ischemia. If it travel to your blood vessels, especially, it can go and it can block to your arteries. You can see that it can block more than one vessels, and with the help of that, what happened, you can see this is the formation of plaque, and due to this the blood cannot flow inside and it can block the flow. So if this obstruction occur in your deep veins, so it can cause deep vein thrombosis. If it occur in your arteries, it can cause arterial obstruction. And if you see, this is a normal flow, and this is a section of vein where the blood is flowing normally. When the thrombus is partially produced, it can block partial section of the blood to flow, and partial cannot be flow, and this can lead to partial occlusion. And if this thrombus formation will be completely blocking the vein, and it can leads to complete occlusion. So deep vein thrombosis usually occur in your deep femoral vein, and this is the physiology of this is the anatomy of the different veins that is present in lower part of your limb. And in the next slide, if you see that if that clot that is showing here, and they travel from the heart and then it reaches to the arteries in the lungs, then what will happen? It can lead to pulmonary embolism. So thank you so much for today's lecture. Hope to see you again in next lecture.